Hello again. Hope you're having a good day so far and you're sufficiently recaffeinated now. The next session is called Follow the Leader, and it's a one-on-one interview with the CEO about leadership on the top, from the top on these issues. So I'm delighted that we're joined today by Brian Krzanich, who is the Chief Executive of Intel. Please welcome Brian Krzanich. Hey, Tom. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to start with a pledge that you made in 2015 to make Intel's workforce mirror the talent available in the country by 2020. So that's a very broad mandate. How's it going?
It's going fantastic. In fact, we've been able to pull it in. So we announced earlier this year that we will achieve that goal by the end of this year, so the end of 2018, almost 2 years earlier than 2020.
Is it true that you announced this back in 2015 without telling the rest of your leadership team, basically so they couldn't stop you?
So the pure answer is yes.
Excellent.
I would say not entirely so they could stop me. I didn't want to have a big debate, because when you have a large organization, maybe 100,000 employees, you can have this debate about how hard is it going to be and how expensive and all of these things versus just, let's move forward. This is the right thing to do. So I was kind of shortcutting the process. Now, interestingly, they all got behind it, though, once it was public.
So there wasn't then pushback afterwards. Everyone jumped on board right away.
Well, there wasn't pushback by the management team.
Right.
The employees struggled then also with what does this mean and how does it affect me personally a bit.
So one of the panels we had earlier on today was about what it means to lead from the top on this. And right at the end of the panel, the panelists gave their short, sweet answers on this. And one of them was, don't count the cost of things and just do what you know is right and get on with it. Was that what drove you to do this?
Oh, absolutely. This is one where in today's world, we're building products. We're a technology company. We build products that our whole goal is to change the experience of every person on this planet through technology. And you can't have an organization that doesn't mirror that planet then, building those technologies and expect it to be meaningful, to change those experiences in a meaningful way if the organization doesn't reflect that and bring that into the products.
Now, I'm guessing that the biggest change you had to make to the makeup of the workforce would have been more women. But did you also have to do specific, and were there specific things you did to improve the inclusivity of LGBT people in particular?
Sure. So our commitment was just across the board. So women was definitely, the largest population, but African Americans and Hispanics and actually, Native Americans, which are a protected class and an underrepresented minority, the technology industry has not been a natural place for them. So a lot of work there. In LGBTQ committee, we have employee groups at Intel, which are groups that are actually run by the employees and sponsored by leaders. And I'd been the sponsor of the LGBTQ group. It was called iGlobe at the time, for a long time. So I knew the community. We've done a lot, everything from same-sex partner benefits for married couples. We retroactively implemented transgender health coverage with no upper end limit, as long as it's the normally approved efforts. Same-sex bathrooms, or all gender bathrooms. But one of the most interesting things we did is we worked with the community, because one of the things that we believe in is that data can help provide solutions and change. So we've been working, we've done it once, we're now implementing it permanently, is a voluntary self-identification. Because a lot of times you go into these discussions and we talk about changing health benefits, and the community of LGBTQ is not always clearly identified. And so we never know exactly what the costs are and how much it's, and that group actually came forward and said, let us self-identify, it's not required, but we'd like to get the data out there, and then we can also look at retention rates, loss. It'll really help us identify what's going on in our business and be an aid to the community.
And what did you find about things such as retention rates?
Well, actually, the retention rate in the community as it stood was actually quite good. It was, I think, because they'd seen such strong leadership and partnership, the community had not any different retention rate from the rest of the Intel population. But we now have one set of data, and this was we only got it 1 year because we kind of manually did it. We're now implementing it into Workday, which is our large corporate-based system. For next year, hopefully, and we'll keep moving forward now to collect the data year over year and really get trends.
Okay, so more broadly, sort of taking off your Intel hat, but speaking as the CEO of a large company, what can leaders of large companies do to serve most effectively as LGBT allies?
Oh, I think, one, it always starts inside, right? So make sure
that's your slogan. You have to say that.
Yeah, no, but that was a good one. Well, I haven't even made that connection, but I do think I see.
It's so ingrained in you, the brand value of this.
And I'm not the marketing guy, by the way. Okay. But I do think I get frustrated where I see a lot of leaders out talking about this, but I know inside their company they're not making the dramatic changes that need to be made. So I do think you've got to start inside, and you've got to make the changes in your own company across the board here. So I always say that first. Secondly, I think coming to conferences like this and giving your commitment and your support for this community and making sure that people see that, both inside your company and outside your company. And then speaking up in the major issues. There have been issues over the last few years around access to restrooms and marriage rights and just going out and speaking and saying, look, this is what's right, this is what's important, and this will impact business. North Carolina was a good example.
So you spoke out in that case and in Georgia, I think, in 2016. So how did that work in practice? How was the response to you taking us down on that internally and externally?
Internally, I think people see this as, again, the right thing to do, and they were okay. I always say, anytime you make a point on social media, you've got to be prepared for whether it's 50% or 40% or there's going to be X percent of haters. So there's this backlash of tweets and things like that. But I'd say the majority of the feedback was very positive, and I think that played out in the long run there.
What about, because obviously Intel operates in a lot of different countries, so have you had to, or have you taken stands in other countries where there is also a hostile environment?
Yeah, I mean, in some countries it's illegal to be a part of this community, and so we always follow the law, but we also believe that we're a large corporation and we can influence, and so what we do is we, support, there's still a known community within the organization, so we support that community. And then secondly is we go and try and start influencing the governments. And, I think there's places like India, like Malaysia, where we're starting to make, Costa Rica is another example, we're starting to make ground and starting to see a change in the population and their acceptance. It's not all there. So we've chosen let's go actually help change the laws and the process and get it so that it's legal.
So we've been talking today about the when in Rome model, the embassy model, which is where you have an inclusive environment within the company, even if you're operating in a country which is much more hostile to LGBT rights, and then the advocacy model. So it sounds as though you're moving from a sort of embassy to an advocacy model in those countries that you.
Yeah, because I think that's the real strength a corporation the size of Intel can do is that advocacy, right? When I walk in, we're one of the largest employers in many of these countries. And so when we walk in and advocate for change, our voice is strong.
And what do the politicians in those countries say? Do they say, look, we'd much rather you didn't talk about this? I mean, how do they respond?
It starts that way in many cases. And we just keep, the change like this, it doesn't ever happen instantly and quickly. But what we see over time is What we try and do is find other organizations to then start coming in with us, like, the HRC or, even the UN and other groups, and come in and start talking about what this workforce is, the value of recognizing this workforce, and the importance to us. And then eventually we get down to the financials, because at the end of the day, countries are like companies, and they run by financials, and we start talking about our willingness to make investments in the future. And when you start getting into that real meat and potatoes, they start to listen differently.
Do you think companies, I mean, that's a great example of how you can exert leadership and leverage on these sorts of things. Do you think large companies like Intel are doing enough in that regard? I mean, generally.
Yeah, I was going to say, first I have to say, it's like that inside thing, right? Yes, we are doing, but I think you can always do more. There are still countries out there that, we're a little bit careful, because I think I have to have a presence there in order to make sure that my voice is going to be heard, because I know at the end of the day I'm going to have to start talking about the investments and our willingness to commit dollars and this impact. So if I'm not in a country, then me going in and being a huge advocate in that space isn't going to necessarily change it. But I can work with other companies and be a voice behind them who maybe do have a large presence there. And that's where I think we have to work together. And the one thing I'd say is the community that's out there within Silicon Valley especially, Mark Benioff and I are constantly emailing and tweeting each other saying, okay, you got to help me here, you got to help me there. Mark's been a great kind of advocate for pulling many of us together against some of these issues. And so we usually find each other in these countries.
Right. I wanted to ask you about the tech industry more broadly, because the tech industry doesn't have a great reputation for diversity. So you've told me what Intel itself is doing. Do you see signs of things changing across the tech industry as a whole?
Yeah, I think it's changing at different rates, and this is where I think I don't know a single company that isn't looking at the diversity issues and saying, we've got to do something about it. I think companies are moving at different rates.
Is it harder just if you're a bigger company? I mean, it sounds as though you've turned around an oil tanker on this very fast in the case of Intel, but is it easier inherently for startups to be more diverse?
I don't think it's any different. I think in some ways a large company you have some advantages. The law of large numbers and my ability to attract large populations, and when you're looking for Native American populations, having a presence in Arizona and certain places kind of gives you an advantage that maybe a startup doesn't. The other hand, startups have ability to move quickly and just make decisions on their own. So I think it's easily the same.
And I wanted to ask you, we've just talked about the sort of advocacy role in places like India and Malaysia. I wanted to go back to the situation in the US, because obviously there were these campaigns that you and Mark Benioff and others were involved with in North Carolina and Georgia and other places in 2016. Do you feel like things have gone backwards in the US, and what have you been doing domestically to try and change things?
So I'll give you my view, and again, I'm probably not the perfect person. I don't think that if you actually look at the progress, it's necessarily gone backwards. I think that it's become more acceptable to allow a large division within the country. And so you see the extreme sides become more visible. And is that because we all have access to social media with equally capability, or is it, the effects of what's going on in politics, which is also more divisive, it feels like right now? I'm not sure. But what I see is that actually progress is moving forward. I see, more women in leadership, more African Americans in positions of power. But what I also see is more divisive communication and discussion going on. So it's that worries me.
So it's the rhetoric versus the reality kind of thing.
Yeah, I think we're all making progress. It could always go faster, but I don't think it's going backwards.
Now, we had a poll in the room, and we also did the same poll on Twitter, about essentially when companies speak up in favor of LGBT rights, to what extent are they doing it as window dressing and PR? And the view on Twitter was extremely cynical and said, oh, it's almost always PR.
Welcome to Twitter.
Right, exactly. You won't be surprised to hear that in this room and in this gathering today, that there was much more belief that companies are sincere when they do this. But what do you do to persuade people that what you're doing is not window dressing, that you're serious about it, that there's a real authentic commitment to this?
Well, nothing but numbers. People see the data and the reality more than anything else. And so I think, I was meeting with some of the community last week and then a couple weeks ago as well. And what I learned was that the best recruiting tool is the community within Intel. And so, I think that community is also the best advocacy of saying that this is not window dressing. They know whether we're really putting, polish on this and just making it shiny, or whether we're really trying to advocate for change. And the feedback they've given me is, no, they believe we're advocating for change, and they're out advocating for Intel, that it's the place for change.
And one of the sort of cold-hearted business reasons for doing this has always been that it's said that you get more innovation in more diverse teams and so forth. Is that something Intel as a company that's very focused on innovation, is that something that you found?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I have great examples. If you're going to go make a wearable device, I mean, it was amazing. It was a group of men making a wearable device for women. Worst decision, and then we added women to that team. Now, those were the technologists that we wanted, but, it was when we added women to the team that the device really took shape. And, I think those are the mistakes that companies are out there making right now, that, diversity is the right answer.
And I wanted to ask you about AI, because AI is a big focus, not just for you, but for the whole tech industry at the moment. And there is, on the one hand, the people who say, well, if we had AIs make decisions about hiring and things like this, that it would be fairer because you would not have any of these human biases. And other people say, no, because we don't know whether we've put the human biases into the systems that we've built. Are you experimenting with any of this? Do you have a view on that?
So, I think that you have to be careful. You can put bias into AI, and you can put bias into AI up front by the people who generate the algorithms and the codes and what you use as filters and things like that. You can also build, bias into AI if you start using data that's generated. So if I start to look at, who successfully is a candidate that gets, through the interview process and hired, and it's all white males doing that interview process, AI is going to just say, well, the most successful people are these people, and I'm going to have that same bias built in, right? Because the tool is an algorithm that just solves for what you like. So I think AI can help us, but we've got to make sure the biases are basically designed out of that system. We've made changes. For example, our interview process, we make sure always is a diverse population. We do not allow the interview team to be non-diverse, because we find that starts to avoid that. So if you start making those kinds of changes and then build that into your AI, it could certainly help the initial screening process and build out some of that bias. I do believe that. But we've got to be careful and thoughtful about how we go and implement it.
And in practice, actually having things like diverse hiring teams is the sort of, is a quicker way.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, there's a decision, and you don't want AI making that final decision about people, right? I think the AI is there to enhance our abilities, not to do the work for us. And so you're going to want a person there making a decision about how does this person fit in and all. And you've got to make sure that that is a diverse team that's making that final decision. We have definitely seen changes. We all know, if you looked in this room, somehow an organization that's led by women always seems to find a lot of top women talent inside there. And so we have a saying, like likes like. And so what you have to make sure is there's enough diversity.
And like hires like as well.
Exactly. And so you have to make sure there's enough diversity in there making that decision so that you get a good answer.
Okay, final question about how you transmit culture and cultural values within an organization. You can't go and talk to 100,000 people individually. How do you set the direction and the culture, and how in practice do you transmit that to the people below you and then into the whole organization?
I do think that it starts with changing the population. So, you know, Intel, if you look at Intel now versus 5 years ago, and you walked into the cafe, for example, it's different, right? So the population looks different. There's just a different look to it and a different feel. And so as you start to do that, then that culture starts to change, right? It becomes more diverse, and more diversity then becomes more accepting of that. So that, I think part of it is just making those changes, driving that into the organization helps. The second thing is you go out, and we brought a we're engineers, we brought a neuroscientist in who started helping us understand that we all have biases. You all have biases in this room. Get over it. Figure it out, and make sure there are people around you to help balance that bias out. And so, you know, we accepted that. We accept biases and say, okay, fine, then let's move on. How do we make sure that the decisions aren't driven by those biases? So that was the next thing we did, to start changing the culture. And now we're moving into this. We've talked about diversity, inclusion, and the next step is belonging. That when a person feels like they belong as a part of the organization, that's when they're really unleashed. That's when they're like going to give you the 120%. And so, for example, we have our top 400 leaders in a couple of weeks here, and I'm going to personally go out there and give them some stories that I've gotten from people of not belonging. Like, they are introduced, and they're introduced differently, they're treated differently. And I'm going to ask all 400 of those leaders to go find one person this year who doesn't feel like they belong for whatever reason. They could be part of the LGBTQ community. They could just be different. And go find a way to make them belong. And I think that will start a cascade as well. So it's just those little things of constantly doing that and getting to a place where everybody, no matter who you are and what your preclusivity is of behavior, just feels like they belong. So the nerdy person, or I'm an introvert, I want to feel like I belong in a community that may not be full of introverts, as an example.
Great. Okay, Brian Krzanich, thank you very much indeed.
Oh, it was a great time.
Thank you.
Thank you.